live. I am reading Many Lifetimes by Joan Grant and Denis, Kelsey, who was her husband. He was a therapist as well, a hypnotherapist, and she was who she was, a psychic who wrote books and also could read people. This is chapter 1, Far Memory. I was 29 before I managed to recover the technique of being able to relive an earlier incarnation in detail, and as a deliberate exercise. Until then, my conviction that I had many lifetimes before I was born of English parents in London on the 12th April 1907 was based on disjointed episodes from 7 previous lives, 4 male and 3 female. These episodes, although as natural as memories from more immediate yesterdays, are frustrating because I could not fill in the gaps in continuity which would have linked them into coherent sequences. That everyone else did not have even this small degree of far memory was so difficult to understand that until I was 11, I presumed that other people's reticence about their own long history was only another of the incomprehensible taboos that complicated an Edwardian childhood. I also thought that everyone else had second sight, for as grown-ups pretended not to see each other if they met while scuttling in dressing gowns to the bathroom, it seems no more and no less illogical that they pretended to ignore anyone who did not happen to be conventionally clothed in a physical body. In my early 20s, by which time I was married to Leslie Grant and had a daughter, Gillian, I tried to extend the range of my perception by waking myself several times each night in order to write down my dreams. The majority of these dreams were only fragments of intellectual data, forming patterns which had no more significance than those formed by revolving a kaleidoscope. But there were a few fertile grains among the chaff, and about twice a week I either brought back a clear recollection of what I had been doing on a supramaterial level of activity, or some incident which I knew concerned one of my earlier personalities. By this time I had acquired sufficient empirical experience to see the broad outlines of the progress of an individual during the initial 4 phases of his evolution. He starts with only enough energy to organize a single molecule. As this energy increases and his consciousness begins to expand, he requires more complex forms through which to express them. After growing too adult to be contained by the mineral phase of existence, he enters the vegetable kingdom and then graduates by a series of incarnations as various species of animal, to his first incarnation as a member of the race of Homo sapiens. During his first few lifetimes as a human being, the whole of his personality incarnates, so he is likely to have approximately the same capacities and perceptions, whether he happens to be incarnate or excarnate. But as his consciousness expands, it becomes too wide to be contained within the framework of a single personality. So the incarnate individual is now both a single personality and an integral component of his total self. He is in effect both the segment of an orange and part of the whole orange, the juice which is the essence of them both, being the character he has acquired by his own efforts during the course of his personal evolution. Having been educated less through the efforts of numerous governesses and tutors than by listening to the conversation of my father and his fellow scientists, and then working for 4 years as a laboratory assistant in a mosquito control institute, I was always alert to the possibility that the incidents of far memory might be only fantasies, based on my hopes and fears or on what I had heard or seen or read. Had radio, television, or more than a primitive form of cinematograph then been invented, my self-doubts would have been even more acute. With practice, I eventually learned how to discriminate between the pseudo and the factual, between a thought form I had created, such as the thought forms of the position of chessmen when playing the game without looking at the board, and a scene which had its own objective reality. To take a simple example, if I saw two men walking across a courtyard, one wearing a red and the other a green tunic, and I could change the color of the tunics or even turn the tunics into kilts, then it was only a thought form. If the scene could not be altered, however intently I tried to change it, then I accepted its validity. A more personal, convincing check was that the emotions and the sensations associated with a genuine recall were as vivid as though they were being felt by myself in the factual present. The alteration of the focus of my attention had caused an incident in the past again to become here and now. Sometimes this could not only terrifying but physically painful, for there was no awareness of the intervening period of clock time to cushion the immediacy of the impact. So far as I have been able to discover, it is no more difficult to recall an episode which took place several millennia ago than to recall one from the current or the preceding century. Here the analogy between a series of personalities and the segments of an orange is again opposite, time being the center at which the segments join and from which they are equidistant. The concept of successive personalities being threaded by time like beads on a string is intellectually expedient, but misleading. Experience suggests that the earlier life, which has the greatest resonance to the current one, is the most likely to be recalled. This resonance may be set in motion by some close similarity of situation, by some mutual direction of effort, or by a resurgence of an intense emotion. Revisiting a once familiar scene can sometimes evoke a spontaneous flashback, but this is seldom of more than mild interest. I spent 3 weeks in Egypt with Leslie in March 1935, but except for being surprised that certain avenues of trees no longer led from Hatshepsut's temple to Karnak, and feeling depressed that there were so many ruins instead of being pleased that there was so much left to see, I had no intimations that I had spent the best part of 2,000 years in the Nile Valley. 18 months later, through the trivial catalyst of psychometrizing a scarab, I did the first of the 115 total records, which became a posthumous autobiography of over 120,000 words. The scarab belonged to Daisy Sartorius, whose house had become my real home since the day I went there, during a particularly unhappy crisis of my youth. She had already had the first of several operations for the cancer from which she died a year later, and it was a love we shared which caused me to concentrate on a life in which she had been my mother, in the first dynasty of Egypt, about 3,000 years BC. The technique of this type of far memory, as opposed to the isolated incident, which is a spontaneous recall or recovered with the aid of hypnosis, entails learning how to shift the level of the majority of one's attention from the current personality to the earlier one, while still retaining sufficient normal waking consciousness to dictate a running commentary of the earlier personality's thoughts, emotions, and sensations. During the early stages, I would often think I had been dictating clearly, only to discover at the end of a session that I had not spoken a word. On other occasions, I would think I had been speaking so slowly that at least a minute had elapsed between each phrase, and then find that I had been talking so fast that Leslie, who could do speed writing but not shorthand, had been able to get down only a bare outline of what I had said. Eventually I was to accept an instruction to speak louder or more slowly, but this took considerable practice, and until I had gained it, any kind of interruption would break the thread of concentration, and I might not be able to get anything at all for 2 or 3 days. Although I would usually begin a session by giving the age of Sekita, it was that earlier personality's name, I could not predetermine which period of her life I was going to relive. One session might find me enjoying some happy incident from her childhood, and then the next she was watching an operation in which a man's skull was being trepanned after he had been thrown from his chariot during a lion hunt. By this time I knew that Sekita was the daughter of Pharaoh, and that she became co-ruler with her brother after her father's death. Between an idyllic childhood and the lonely years of rulership, Sekita spent 10 years in a temple, learning the far memory which would allow her to speak with personal authority. The temples of that time were not places of worship, but were comparable to co-educational universities or teaching hospitals, in which pupils learned various forms of extrasensory perception. Seers, whose role was similar to the modern radiologist, healers who supplied extra energy to the physical body of their patients, and who were considered senior to the physicians, hypnotists who induced anesthesia during surgical operations, or for a difficult childbirth, and temple counselors, who had a great deal more insight than the majority of modern psychiatrists. In fact, they would have been amazed that the people whose label means healer of the soul often do not believe in the existence of the organ they purport to treat. Those who were training for a degree in far memory usually gained the additional qualification of being able to tune into the relevant episode from a patient's earlier life, which was affecting his present personality. They also had to be able to remember at least 10 of their own deaths, so as to be able to reassure anyone who suffered from a fear of dying, although this was seldom necessary in that enlightened culture, in which birth and death were familiar changes of state, as commonplace as sleeping and waking. The graduation examination for far memory was arduous. The pupil was shut in an initiation chamber, entered by a narrow passage closed by 3 drop stones to increase its resemblance to a tomb, for the initiation symbolized a rebirth. When I, or rather Sekita, heard those drop stones fall, I knew I would be alone in the dark silence for 4 days and 4 nights. I had 3 alternatives. I could try to avoid the issue by staying awake, in which case I should have to leave the temple and would never be able to serve Egypt as a winged pharaoh, a priest as well as a ruler. I could try to do that what was expected of me and fail, which might drive me insane. Shall I be as Hecate, who failed yet did not die, and who sits in the courtyard with blind eyes and wet, sagging lips? Or I must prove that I could remember other levels of reality. Remember the beautiful country which makes living in 3 dimensions seem so heavy, so small and so drab. And remember the hells which men create for themselves in spite of the best endeavors of their forerunners, from the substances of their own cruelty, their own paucity of affection. Sekita then had to undergo 7 ordeals, which had been designed by her instructors to assure them that her insight would not be impaired by unresolved terror from her long history. The recall of these 4 days and nights took 5 hours of clock time, but Leslie had writer's cramp, and I was so exhausted that I could only drag myself upstairs by clutching the banisters. I hoped to sleep for hours, but the 7th ordeal, in which Sekita had to overcome a gigantic cobra, had produced such a keen resurgence of my fear of snakes that within a few minutes I woke, reliving the same sequence. I saw before me a great pit, and I landed in a rustling sea of snakes. A mighty cobra reared upon its coils. Vipers writhed and slithered across the floor, weaving an endless pattern of venom and death. Yet must I walk across their chaining coils and crush the cobra between my hands. Its eyes glittered scarlet, and its mighty hood shone with the brilliance of its armored scales. It seemed that for an endless span of time I stood with horror naked in my eyes. Then I walked into this hissing pit, and the vipers drew back before me in vicious waves. and then I seized the cobra below its swaying head and held it from me as it tried to strike. 10,000 times, again 10,000 times, I thought that I had reached the final refuge of my desperate will. It seemed that time was endless and earth grown cold, until under the last onslaught of my will, the mighty serpent slid down on its coils, and I was with its dead body in an empty pit. I was so convinced that the cobra was in the bed that Leslie, who was almost as tired as I was, could calm me only by stripping off the bedclothes and shaking them out of the window. As we were then living near Grantown, and it was midwinter when the bedroom was so cold that the water pitcher had usually frozen solid before dawn, this was yet another occasion when I have inadvertently proved a tiresome companion. Even then I dared not sleep, and had rigors, cramps, fever, and a blinding headache which immobilized me for 48 hours. Had I not known that Daisy looked forward to the copies of the sessions I posted to her nearly every day, I think that at this point I would have chosen a less exacting profession. By now I had recorded about 2,000 episodes, for a single session might include 2 or 3 incidents which apparently were entirely unrelated. At least once an hour I had to break concentration for a brief rest, and often was then unable to tune in to the same sequence. If Leslie read back what I had dictated immediately I had returned to normal waking consciousness, I could supply a word he had missed. But after about 10 minutes the memory had faded, and I could remember no more than a hazy outline of what I had been saying. I wish tape recorders had already been available, because I have often been told that the emotional color of my voice, which is normally very flat, had a remarkably wide range, but during this type of level shift it sounds to me remote and impersonal, so this is only hearsay. One day Leslie and I spread all the episodes out on the drawing room floor to arrange them in chronological sequence. For the first time I noticed that 2 parts of the same conversation often dovetailed completely, even though several weeks had elapsed between the 2 recordings. For instance, a session which began when I was 23 concerned a long conversation with someone called Petar Kiefer, which was interrupted by the insistent ringing of the telephone. When Leslie asked, "This is the first time Petar Kiefer has been mentioned. Who is he?" I could not tell him, for I was unable to shift level again that evening. For at least in my experience, far memory entails a very precise focus of attention, and, as when using a long-range telescope, the field of vision does not include anything extraneous. A few days later, when I tuned in to Sakita's childhood, I said, Petar Kiefer, who was one of the chief officials of the royal household, sat on the left side of the of the hall of audience, between the throne of Pharaoh and the table of the scribes. Then, several weeks later, the first, not the second part of the conversation with Petar Kiefer was recorded, and when joined together, where there was not even a phrase missing in the continuity. This was very reassuring for me, for my father's insistence on the scientific approach had made me somewhat over-skeptical of my own faculties. I knew that if I had wished to become a historical novelist, I would not have been so idiotic as to make the job infinitely more complicated by inventing disjointed episodes and then hoping that they would fit like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. I knew that my knowledge of Egyptian history was minimal, and that if I had been venal enough to want to perpetrate an elaborate hoax, I would have first embarked on a very careful historical research, instead of scrupulously not doing any. I knew that when I felt that some incident of Sakita's life had only one logical outcome, recall would often reveal that the facts were entirely different, neither what she would have hoped nor what I would have imagined. But I also knew that, convincing as these factors were to me, they would not be accepted as evidence to anyone else. It is unlikely that Sakita's autobiography would ever have had a wider readership than Daisy and a few intimate friends who were tolerant of my ESP, because the rest of my behavior was so stalwartly ordinary if in June 1937 I had not gone to London for a wedding at which Gillian was to be a bridesmaid, and Leslie the best man. While Leslie was at the groom's stag party, I dined with Guy McCaw, a contemporary of my father, whom I met by chance at Prince's Tennis Club, Royal, not lawn tennis, a game played in New York at the Racket and Tennis Club, which I began to learn at the age of 7 in my father's court. Guy asked me, "What on earth are you doing buried up in Scotland? You can't even shoot grouse in the winter, or have you become addicted to salmon fishing?" Mildly annoyed that he thought no one would enjoy Scotland unless they were killing something, I forgot that I had promised Leslie to be discreet. I catch an occasional trout when I'm not too busy, but I spend most of my time remembering who I used to be when I lived in Egypt during the First Dynasty. "Good God, Joan, have you gone off your head?" He scrutinized me and seemed relieved that I laughed at him. "You gave me quite a shock. I didn't realize you were joking." "I'm not joking. I have dictated about 60,000 words of what, even if you think I made it up, is an interesting story." "Well, let me read it." He plumped his impeccable white moustache with the back of his hand and then said pontifically, "I will read it, providing it is typed, but I'm not going to wade through pages of your handwriting. I always tell people the truth, however unpalatable. So, if it is nonsense, I shall be brutally candid." I'd had no intention of showing anyone the carbon copy of the typescript, which I had brought with me to give to Daisy, but Guy's bland assumption that any claim to far memory could be no more than an imaginative outpouring, which should be sterilized by a swab of criticism, caused me to send it to him the following morning. I enclosed a brief note thanking him for an excellent dinner and asking him to forward the typescript to Daisy, as by the time I had finished reading it, I would have returned to Scotland. By the time he had finished reading it, I would have returned to Scotland. I did not mention this breach of confidence to Leslie, because I had expected to hear nothing more about it. But Guy wrote to me, "To my great surprise, you have written something far better than you apparently recognize. I consider it should be published, and have therefore given it to Arthur Barker." Both Leslie and I were dismayed, though for different reasons. Leslie, because Arthur was a fellow Wycomist, and might mention it in the clubs to which they both belonged, that Mr. Grant had ideas which were exceedingly odd. I, because Arthur seemed such a die-hard materialist, that I thought he would throw a couple of 100 carefully typed pages into the waste-paper basket. In fact, Arthur sent me a telegram. When Leslie brought it to me, it had come over the telephone while I was out for a walk with Gillian. He looked so glum that I thought Daisy had died. It read, "Essential, you complete manuscript in 6 weeks, so that we can publish it in October. Stop. Blurb will state most exciting and important book we have ever published. Stop. Congratulations. Stop. Arthur." This telegram, although I did not recognize it at the time, heralded the termination of my first marriage. I first became aware of the existence of the personality who became the I of my second book, while still recording Sakita. Sir Henry Wood, who took it for granted that musical genius was the result of several lifetimes directed towards developing this particular talent, had been listening to me dictate. At the end of the session, Leslie switched on the radio, as I had asked him to do when anyone else was present, so as to spare me having to talk through the awkward period of transition between two levels. The broadcast was of Haydn, played on a harpsichord, and I mentioned that I had been listening to Egyptian music only a few minutes earlier. Henry said eagerly, "Can you hear the Egyptian music and the Haydn at the same time? For it would be very interesting if you could tell me how closely they are related." I shifted level again very easily, and the harpsichord went out of hearing. When I came back, Leslie asked, "Can you remember where you have been and what instrument you were playing?" I could still feel the strings rippling under my fingers. in Italy, said Leslie. You were born near Perugia, early in the 16th century. Don't try to talk. Wait until I've read it back to you. I was born early in the morning of the 4th of May in the year of our Lord, 1510, and I died in the autumn of 1537. Though I was conceived in a great bed, I opened my new eyes in the north-west turret of the house of Britain. My cradle was of dark carved wood, and my mother used to rock it with her foot while she had laid her silk threads into smooth stitches. She was the sewing woman of the castle. My name was Carola. My grandmother banished us when I was 7 years old, before my father brought a bride from Spain. We were befriended by the strong man of a troop of strolling players. I learned to sing and play a lute. There was another singer and a jester, a hunchback, whom I loved very much. Then something terrible happened. I can't remember yet what it was. I was in a convent. The first abbess was kind, but the next one tortured me as a heretic. But I managed to escape. I thought I was dying, but I was taken into the house of a wise and gentle old man, Carlos, who married me, and my name was Carola di Ludovici. Then I died, and I soon began to laugh and become thinner and thinner. Then he died, and I soon began to cough and became thinner and thinner. I was looked after by Anna. It seems that I'm already separate from my body. It is not Carola whose hair Anna braids, nor Carola who drinks cordials to please her Anna. It is as though I watch her try to mend my dress and wonder why she weeps to see the velvet thread there when I know I have to wear it so short a while. In about 200 words dictated during 25 minutes, I had in Chapter 1, have a lovely Monday.